done everything you were told to do, changed the job, left the relationship, moved cities, meditated, journaled, set boundaries, started over, and still the same hollow ache creeps back into your chest at 3 a.m., wearing a different shirt but speaking the same language. You're not fixing your life. You're rearranging the scenery on a stage where the script was written before you ever walked on. And if you dare to stay with me for the next 30 minutes, you'll see the playwright hiding in the blind spot of your own awareness. Not because you're broken, but because Jung was right about one thing most people never let themselves hear. The prison you're running from isn't out there. It's built into the way you've been taught to perceive. 1. You've been chasing a mirage dressed as reality. Almost every one of us enters adulthood carrying a quiet, unexamined assumption. Life is something that exists independently, a solid film rolling out there, and you are simply a lens moving through it. When something feels off, emptiness, dread, a sense of wrongness you can't name, you immediately check the outside. The environment must be wrong. The people must be wrong. Your choices must have been wrong. So you fix. You optimize. You swap circumstances the way a chess player rearranges pieces, believing the game will finally feel right. But Carl Jung argued that this very reflex is the root mistake. What you call life, the texture, the weight, the emotional tone of your days, is not raw data from the outside world. It is your psychological construction of that data, filtered through a dense inner architecture you never chose consciously. Two people walk into the same Monday morning meeting. One experiences it as a pressure chamber. The other feels it as a neutral transaction. The room didn't change. The agenda didn't change. What differs is the interior weather system each person carries into that space. Jung called this your psychological reality. It's the only reality you ever directly taste. And if you don't understand that distinction, you will spend years, decades, mistaking your inner climate for the objective truth of your life. You'll believe you're seeing clearly, when in fact, you're seeing the world through a lens you didn't realize you were wearing. That confusion is not philosophical. It's the reason your long-term exhaustion never lifts, no matter how many external changes you make. Let me tell you about a woman I'll call Amara. She was a lead designer at a respected firm. From the outside, everything gleamed: recognition, steady income, a partner who cared. Yet over several years, a quiet erosion set in. She couldn't point to a catastrophe. She just felt, increasingly, like she was watching her life through thick glass. She changed teams. She took a sabbatical. She enrolled in coaching. The relief would last a few weeks and then dissolve, leaving the same disconnection. From a Jungian perspective, Amara wasn't facing a career problem or a relationship problem. She was rubbing against the outline of a much deeper structure. She had become habitually absent from her own inner world. She'd spent so long adapting, performing the role of the competent, agreeable, successful person, that living, the act of sustained inner contact, had quietly ceased. And when living ceases, no amount of adapting can fill the vacancy. Jung drew a sharp line between adaptation and aliveness. Adaptation smooths your edges to fit the collective. It wins you safety, approval, a functional place in the machinery. Living, on the other hand, requires you to turn inward and face what you actually feel, value, fear, and long for, especially the parts that don't fit the public persona. When the rift between these two widens enough, life begins to send signals, not melodramatic disasters, but a pervasive emotional undertow, low-grade restlessness, unexplainable fatigue, a feeling of being a passenger in your own existence. Many people diagnose this as burnout, midlife crisis, or just adulting. Jung saw it as the psyche crying out for recognition. Consider navigating with a borrowed device programmed by someone else. The routes are pre-approved, the destinations labeled sensible, admirable, safe. The voice gives calm directions, and for years you follow. But the internal compass, the part of you that knows what genuinely moves your soul, hasn't been consulted. Eventually, that device can't tell you where to go when the road feels meaningless. You will have arrived at the coordinates it promised and still feel lost. That's not a sign you failed. It's a sign you were walking a map someone else drew, and now the discrepancy between outer direction and inner orientation has become too loud to ignore. Jung would have said this moment isn't a crisis of circumstances, it's a crisis of consciousness. And so the first real shift happens not when you change what you do, but when you change where you look for the source of your experience. If you've been silently telling yourself, if I just fix the job, the relationship, the city, then I'll feel right, you've been handing your inner authority to external variables. But the moment you suspect that what you call life is, in truth, a reflection of your inner arrangement, the whole game begins to change. You stop being a victim of the weather and start noticing the climate system you carry within you. That small adjustment, barely visible from the outside, is the first tremor of something enormous. What you just felt, if a part of you tightened or leaned in, that's not random. That's the first layer of the unconscious stirring, and it leads directly to the next recognition, one that cracks the illusion wide open. 2. The world you walk through has your fingerprints all over it. Once the idea settles, even faintly, that your experience isn't a neutral broadcast, another question rises. Why does the same workplace feel like a prison to you, but a playground to someone else? Why do you keep meeting versions of the same difficult person wherever you go? Jung's answer is blunt. You don't enter any room as a blank slate. You walk in with a pre-existing psychological atmosphere, formed by early imprints, forgotten wounds, unspoken fears, and that atmosphere colors every pixel you perceive. In Jungian terms, there's no such thing as a purely objective experience. The unconscious actively participates in shaping what reaches your conscious awareness. So when you say, "My life feels heavy," you're not describing a weather report. You're describing the way your inner structures are filtering and emphasizing certain data. Someone with an unconscious expectation of rejection will scan any social gathering and find micro-signals of exclusion, not because those signals are manufactured by others every time, but because the inner lens is tuned to the rejection frequency. This explains why two siblings can emerge from the same household with radically different emotional imprints. The events were similar, but the inner processing centers were distinct. One learned to scan for threat, the other learned to scan for opportunity. Neither sees the truth in a vacuum. Both see what their unconscious believes it needs to survive. Think of a night dream. In a dream, you walk through a world that feels utterly real. Characters appear, conflicts erupt, you feel fear, longing, humiliation. Until you wake, you never stop to say, "This is all happening inside my head." You react as if it's entirely external. Jung wrote that waking life operates through an almost identical mechanism, only with better camouflage. The daytime world is a dream you've forgotten you're dreaming, so you treat its events as entirely independent of you. But what if that's the greatest sleight of hand the psyche ever performed? What if every scene you walk into is co-authored by the one who's watching? Take a moment with that. If your emotional reactions aren't proof of a hostile universe, but clues about the architecture of your own unconscious, then your most intense frustrations become diagnostic tools. The boss who triggers you, the partner who seems to withdraw at the exact same moment you lean in, the recurring argument that moves from one relationship to another. None of it is only about them. It's about the inner fault line their behavior activates. Jung wasn't saying people don't harm you. He was saying that your persistent suffering often says more about the shape of your inner world than about the cruelty of the outer one. And this recognition that the external world acts as a continuous mirror transforms how you interpret difficulty. Instead of asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" you slowly learn to ask, What is being touched in me right now? The shift is seismic. It doesn't excuse others' behavior. It returns agency to you. Because if the same dynamic shows up in different costumes, then perhaps changing the costume won't stop the play. Only rewriting the script at the level of consciousness will. To ground this, allow me a small practice. The next time a familiar emotional storm hits, maybe irritation, maybe a spike of insecurity, pause for exactly one breath. Don't suppress it. Don't analyze it. Just silently note, there is my reaction. And behind it sits a piece of me that wants to be seen. You don't need to fix anything. The noticing alone begins to loosen the identification. Jung believed that the moment you stop fusing fully with your emotional weather, you step back into the director's chair, not to control the storm, but to understand why it was cast in your life. And as you start to see the hidden hand you've had in constructing your experienced reality, you will inevitably stumble into an even more unsettling corridor, the people who irritate you beyond reason, and the strangers who magnetize you without cause. What you're about to hear next might reorganize how you view every relationship in your life. 3. What you can't stand, and what you desperately crave, are messengers from the dark. You know that person, maybe it's a colleague, maybe it's a certain public figure, whose mere presence makes your skin tighten before a word is spoken. You've told yourself it's their arrogance, their loudness, their passivity, their neediness. The reason feels obvious, but Jung would ask you to pause and turn the inquiry inward. Not because they're innocent, but because the intensity of your reaction is rarely proportional to what they are doing. It's proportional to what they are activating within you. Jung named this dynamic the shadow and projection. The shadow is not a bag of evil. It's the repository of all the qualities you learned very early to disown, because they threatened your belonging. If direct anger was punished in your household, you learned to stifle it. That anger didn't vanish. It retreated underground, where it awaits someone who will carry it for you. When you then meet a person who expresses anger freely, you don't just observe them. You get flooded. The emotion rushes in, because, at a limbic level, they are living on behalf of a part of you were forbidden to live. The hatred is a smoke signal from the basement. The same mechanism fuels intense admiration. A stranger who quit a secure career to chase art. A friend who says no without guilt. Someone who lives with a carelessness you'd never permit yourself. You may feel a strange, magnetic pull. That pull isn't always love. It's often projection, your own unlived potential dressed in their shape. Jung famously remarked that one doesn't become whole by ignoring the basement, but by slowly, carefully turning the lights on down there. Not to act on everything, but to become conscious of everything. Consciousness is the only path to choice. Imagine your inner life as a grand estate. Only a handful of rooms are lit and used daily. The parlor of professionalism, the kitchen of caretaking, the hallway of niceness, but there are wing after wing that have been sealed off. Doors marked too selfish, too emotional, too wild. They weren't locked by accident. They were locked by survival, and yet those chambers don't disappear. They hum with energy. When you encounter someone freely inhabiting one of your sealed rooms, the light leaks through the cracks, and you feel either a surge of repulsion or a wave of fascination. The outer world in that moment is simply where your inner floor plan becomes visible. What makes this so practically powerful is that you don't need to act on every impulse. You only need to recognize the signal. When irritation spikes, instead of rehearsing the other person's faults, ask quietly, what trait do they display that I've never permitted in myself? When fascination surges, ask, what quality do I admire that I've been starving in my own life? The answers won't always be comfortable, but they will be informative. And information, in the Jungian sense, is the beginning of disarming the automatic. A woman once wrote to me about her visceral discomfort around people who openly celebrated their own achievements. She'd been raised to believe that self-promotion was vulgar. Her reaction was fierce moral judgment, until she traced the thread inward. What she found wasn't that she should start boasting. It was a buried hunger to be seen for her own work. A hunger she dressed in contempt to keep it at bay. The moment she named that, the charge in the room shifted. The people who triggered her didn't become saints. They simply stopped holding the keys to her emotional state. That's the quiet reclamation Jung called individuation. The gradual, non-linear process of withdrawing your projections and owning more of your inner territory. Every strong emotion you feel toward another person, in this light, becomes a doorway. And the most scandalous part? The very people you'd do anything to avoid, and the very people you can't stop thinking about, are often the closest you'll come to a map of your own unvisited interior. The question is, will you keep fighting them? Or will you finally read the map? Now, if you've followed me this far, you might already be noticing a pattern. Your inner architecture doesn't just shape perception, it also orchestrates recurrence. And that's the next piece, the one that explains why you keep solving problems that refuse to stay solved. 4. Why the same wound keeps dressing in different costumes and coming back. It's one of the most maddening human experiences. You escape a draining friendship, only to find a new acquaintance who drains you the same way 2 years later. You leave a role that made you feel invisible, and yet, in an entirely different field, that old shadow of invisibility returns. The details shift, the hair color, the job title, the city, but the emotional signature is unmistakable. If you're honest, it feels like a curse. Jung saw it as the opposite. It's the unconscious's persistent, even compassionate, attempt to get your attention. When an important inner conflict remains outside the reach of awareness, it doesn't retire. It impersonates different scenarios, latching onto whatever fresh material is available. Think of it as a core emotional melody that the brain keeps replaying through new arrangements. A boss, a partner, a health scare, always with the same fundamental chord progression. Jung termed these energy clusters complexes. They are not mere thoughts. They are semi-autonomous psychic units with their own memory, emotional charge, and gravitational pull. Unseen, they arrange your life like an invisible stagehand, making sure the same story gets performed over and over. Modern neuroscience, in its own dialect, confirms this. The brain prunes for efficiency. Neural pathways that fire together strengthen. Early survival strategies, pleasing, withdrawing, attacking, become default motorways, activated before the conscious mind even registers a situation. That's why a person can logically understand they're safe, yet still feel panic in a new relationship. The conscious understanding doesn't automatically reach the subterranean wiring. Changing the outer landscape without addressing the inner circuit board is like repainting a car that has a misfiring engine. It looks different, but the ride remains just as unstable. Jung would say that repetition is not punishment. It is the psyche's most articulate language, using the only vocabulary it has, symbols and emotions. Each time the pattern returns, it arrives with slightly more detail. Look, here again. Can you feel it now? This is the texture of your neglect. This is what it tastes like to abandon yourself in this specific way. Healing, in this framework, isn't about obliterating the pattern. It's about bringing enough consciousness to the pattern that it no longer needs to operate behind your back. Picture a recurring dream where you keep walking up the same staircase, arriving at the same locked door. Waking up, you tell yourself, at least it's just a dream. But the dream repeats because the dream maker is trying to show you something. The locked door isn't a punishment. It's an invitation to find the key inside yourself. Your life problems work the same way. You can leave the job, but if the deep belief I am only valuable when I overfunction stays untouched, you will recreate the same exhaustion in the next role. You can leave the relationship, but if the template love must be earned through self-erasure remains, every new romance will eventually bend toward that shape. And here's the practical pivot. Instead of despairing when a familiar ache reappears, not this again, you can practice a subtle reorientation. When the pattern surfaces, you pause and whisper internally, "I recognize you." You've come in a different outfit, but the signature is the same. What do you need me to see this time? You're not surrendering. You're entering into dialogue. The compulsion to escape is replaced by a willingness to decode. And in Jungian terms, that willingness is already a shift in consciousness. This isn't about blaming yourself for the pattern. It's about acknowledging that some part of you is still loyal to an old survival contract, even though you no longer live in the war zone where that contract was signed. The part isn't bad. It's just outdated. And it will keep orchestrating life until someone inside the control room finally says, "I see you. Thank you. We can renegotiate now." Once you start spotting the recurrence, instead of being swallowed by it, you will find yourself standing on a different ledge altogether. One where the role of victim, which once felt like the only honest position, begins to appear as a voluntary seat you can rise from. And that's the delicate, often misunderstood threshold we're about to cross. 5. The invisible seat you've been taught is permanent, and how to quietly stand up. Let's get very close to something sensitive. If you've been hurt, genuinely and profoundly, by people or circumstances, and I'm not here to deny the reality of trauma, there's a deeply human temptation. It's the temptation to build an identity inside that hurt. Not because you enjoy the pain, but because the pain at least offers a story, a role, a position from which everything that happens can be understood. The world does things to me. The wound becomes the center. Every new slight, every disappointment, every abandonment rushes to reinforce the narrative. And each time you retell it, you shrink. Jung saw that the victim posture is not a character flaw. It's a psychological stasis, a zone where the ego freezes to protect itself from the terrifying truth that agency exists alongside wounds. You were harmed, yes, and you also possess the capacity, now, to choose how those harms continue to echo through your current choices. Fully inhabiting that, and is one of the hardest moves a human can make. It's much easier to stay in the either-or. Either I was broken and helpless, or I'm exaggerating. Jung's path cuts through that split. He wrote, in substance, that you are not what happened to you, but what you choose to become with what happened. He was not dismissing the past's gravity. He was insisting that even in the rubble, you retain the power of relationship toward the rubble. You cannot undo what was done, but you can gradually stop feeding it the monopoly on your identity. This isn't loud. It rarely comes with a triumphant declaration. More often it arrives as a quiet withdrawal of your consent. A moment when you notice yourself telling the old story and suddenly think, I don't want to enter that room again. Imagine a person who for years carries a heavy stone in their backpack. The stone is real, but over time they've built the muscles to put it down. Yet they never do, because they've forgotten they're even wearing the backpack. The victim role is like that. It becomes so familiar, so woven into the muscular memory of daily life, that you don't realize the straps are there. The moment you stop playing the victim is not when you pretend the stone never existed. It's when you become aware of the backpack, and you ask yourself, what would happen if I set this down even for an hour? That question, by itself, is a reclamation of agency. Not a declaration of triumph, but a crack in the lens. In daily moments, this shows up as a tiny pause before reaction. Someone cancels on you, and the old script launches, of course. I'm always the one who gets left. But this time, you catch the script mid-sentence. You don't have to argue with it. You just witness it. There's the old belief that I don't matter. I see you. The pain still passes through, but you're no longer drowning in it. You are, in Jung's language, no longer fully identified with the complex. And from that fraction of disidentification, something remarkable grows. You can feel the hurt without letting it author your entire afternoon. You can respond instead of react. That's freedom, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that gradually, over years, redraws the structure of your inner life. The people closest to you may not notice the shift at first. The outer circumstances may look identical, but internally, the axis has tilted. You're no longer asking, "Why does this keep happening to me?" in a voice of despair. You're asking it with genuine curiosity, or even with the calm of an investigator. And that subtle repositioning, from object of fate to participant in meaning, is, for Jung, the signal that consciousness is finally moving from reactive to reflective. If you stay here, right at this edge, you may notice that the entire need to search frantically for a solution, the next book, the next guru, the next epiphany, begins to soften. Not because you're lazy, but because the desperation that fueled the search was rooted in a deep disconnection. And when connection to your own center starts to hum again, the searching changes register. It becomes optional. That's the next, and in many ways final, layer of this journey. 6. When the search exhausts itself, you don't stop moving. You stop running. There's a particular restlessness that marks the modern soul. A constant, low-grade urgency. I need to fix this. I need to understand. I need the next piece. We consume talks, courses, and content as if answers were stockpiled goods. But underneath much of this searching, Jung would have observed a subtle terror. The terror of facing one's own depth without a new distraction. If you truly paused, something uncomfortable might surface. So you keep scrolling, keep chasing, keep optimizing, calling it growth. But growth sometimes looks like a still pond, not a sprint. At a certain phase of inner work, the frantic search drops away, not because you have all the answers, but because you've rediscovered an internal anchor point. Jung called this center the self, not the ego striving for likes and validation, but the deeper organizing principle that can hold your contradictions without forcing a premature resolution. When you're disconnected from the self, every lack feels like a void that must be filled by external sources. When contact is restored, even faintly, the same external searching changes tone. It becomes leisurely, choiceful, no longer driven by the panic of emptiness. Consider the story of an artist I'll call Leo. He spent his 20s chasing gallery representation, networking desperately, bending his style to fit market trends. The harder he pushed, the more his work felt hollow. One year, exhausted, he withdrew to a remote cabin, not to find himself grandiosely, but simply to rest. With no audience and no plan, he started painting what actually moved him. Messy, personal, unsellable in his mind. That body of work later became his breakthrough, but not because he finally figured it out. It was because he stopped painting for the search and began painting from the self. The external success was a side effect of no longer using his art to escape inner deadness. Jung once wrote that the one who looks outward dreams, while the one who looks inward awakens. That awakening is not a rush of ecstasy. It's a quiet, grounded recognition. I am already here. I don't need to go somewhere else to be worthy of my own life. When that lands, the compulsive need to hunt for answers loosens. You still have questions, but they don't torment you. You still learn, but you're no longer addicted to the next hit of information. You can sit in uncertainty without dissolving. That, in Jungian terms, is a hallmark of maturing consciousness, the capacity to be present without grasping. Here's a small practical test. Over the next few days, each time you feel the urge to open a new self-help video or scroll for an insight, pause for 10 seconds. Don't forbid yourself from watching. Just pause. Notice the sensation in the body that's driving the urge. Is there a fear of stillness? A need to escape a low-grade ache? Just see it. Then, if you still want to watch. But from this slightly more conscious place, you may find that half the time the urgency evaporates. Not because you've gotten better, but because the part that was trying to flee has been given a moment of witness. That's the search meeting its source. When searching is no longer necessary, it's not because you've arrived at a finish line. It's because you've realized you were never lost. The path was always beneath your feet. You just hadn't yet turned the attention inward. And from this seat, the whole relationship to growth transforms. You stop trying to become some idealized version of yourself and begin inhabiting more of who you already are. Messy, contradictory, alive. That's not the end of the road. It's the beginning of walking it awake. We're nearing the close. What I hope remains with you is not a set of instructions, but a subtle rearrangement in the furniture of your inner space. You may not feel dramatically different, but perhaps something is quieter now. A little less urgency to fix, a little more permission to see. Jung never wanted followers. He kept pointing people back to their own depths, not his words. He believed that the psyche doesn't need to be conquered. It needs a witness who will stop running long enough to listen. If you felt something shift while listening, even a slight loosening, even a faint recognition, then maybe this is where the endless watching can pause. Maybe what you needed wasn't another video, but the moment you stopped using videos to avoid the silence. And if you want to stay in this space of honest inner work, press like and subscribe, not for more quick answers, but for the kind of dialogue that makes you less afraid to sit still with yourself. The channel isn't here to give you truths to memorize. It's here to help you remember what you already know, but forgot you knew. Thank you for walking this with me. Now, take a deep breath. Notice the weight of your body where you sit. You're already in the room you've been searching for. The rest is just learning how to live with the lights on. Title options. 1. Carl Jung's Darkest Warning. Why you keep living the same life in different costumes. 2. The unconscious is running your life. Here's how to see the script before it repeats. 3. Jung's Map of the Psyche, what your worst fears and deepest cravings are trying to tell you. 4. Stop searching. Start seeing. The Jungian shift that ends the chase forever. 5. Your life is a mirror. Reveal the hidden patterns that control everything you feel. Description. Why do the same problems, same conflicts, and same hollow feelings keep returning no matter how many external changes you make? Carl Jung believed the answer doesn't live in your circumstances. It lives in the unconscious patterns you've never been taught to recognize. This video takes you step by step through 6 transformative recognitions: the psychological reality behind experience, the projection of your shadow, the coded return of emotional wounds, the quiet exit from victim identity, and the moment searching finally gives way to inner rest. No gimmicks. No hollow motivation. Just a clear, grounded framework for seeing the architecture of your own mind, and the liberation that comes when you stop fighting a mirror. If you're tired of running in circles, this is the place to pause and finally listen.